Okay, so back at it. Going to this video is going to focus on sensory spinal pathways. I already did a video on the fibromyalgia and myofascial pain syndrome and the pain scales for adults and children. For the reading for February 28th on Friday. So I'm running a little bit behind on recordings, but I will eventually. So the first reading is going to be from this reading is going to be from the 7th edition. Start it.
Pathways for transmission of somatic sensory signals. Somatic sensory information enters the spinal cord through the dorsal roots. Sensory signals are then carried to higher centers via ascending pathways from one of two systems: the anterolateral spinothalamic system or the dorsal column, medial limniscal system. Anterolateral spinothalamic pathway. The spinothalamic tracts are diffuse pathways concerned with non-discriminative sensations such as pain, temperature, tickle, itch, and sexual sensations. The system is activated primarily by mechanoreceptors, thermoreceptors, and nociceptors, and is composed of afferent fibers that are small diameter and slowly conducting. Sensory signals transmitted by this system do not require discrete localization of signal source or precise gradations in intensity. After originating in the dorsal roots, the fibers of the spinothalamic pathway immediately cross and ascend up the spinal cord through the medulla, pons, and midbrain to the ventroposterolateral (VPL) nucleus of the thalamus. Figure 3.4. Axons of the VPL neurons project to the somatosensory cortex via the internal capsule. Compared with the dorsal column, medial limniscal system, the anterolateral spinothalamic pathways make up a cruder, more primitive system. The spinothalamic tracts are capable of transmitting a wide variety of sensory modalities. However, their diffuse pattern of termination results in only one of three. Crude abilities to localize the source of a stimulus on the body surface and in poor intensity discrimination, 2 of 3. The three major tracts of the spinothalamic system are the 1. Anterior, ventral, spinothalamic tract, which carries the sensations of crudely localized light touch and pressure. 2. The lateral spinothalamic tract, which carries pain and temperature. And 3. The spinoarticular tract, which is involved with pain sensations, especially diffuse, deep, and chronic pain. Dorsal column to the power of medial limniscal pathway. This system is responsible for the transmission of discriminative sensations received from specialized mechanoreceptors. Sensory modalities that require fine gradations of intensity and precise localization on the body surface are mediated by the system. Sensations transmitted by the dorsal column, medial limniscal pathway include discriminative touch, stereognosis, tactile pressure, paragnosis, graphesthesia, recognition of texture, kinesthesia, two-point discrimination, proprioception, and vibration. The system is composed of large, myelinated, rapidly conducting fibers. After entering the dorsal column, the fibers ascend to the medulla and synapse with the dorsal column nuclei gracilis and cuneatus. From here they cross to the opposite side and pass up to the thalamus through bilateral pathways called the medial lemnisci. Each medial lemniscus terminates in the ventral posterolateral thalamus. From the thalamus, third-order neurons project to the somatic sensory cortex. Projection to sensory association areas in the cortex allows for the perception and interpretation of the combined cortical sensations. Figure 3.5. Table 3.2 presents a comparison of the most salient features of each ascending pathway. 3 of 3.
Okay, so that is the reading. And here's the table 3.2. Features of pathways for transmission of somatic sensory signals. Anterolateral spinal thalamic tract, non-discriminative. For example, pain, temperature. Broad spectrum of sensory modalities, crude localization, poor intensity discrimination, poor spatial orientation relative to origin of stimulus. Afferent fibers are small in diameter and slow in conducting. The origin is the skin, thermoreceptors, mechanoreceptors, and nociceptors. Projection is from the dorsal roots of the spinal nerves, synapse at dorsal horns. Fibers cross and move up the spinal cord through the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain to the ventro-posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus. The dorsal column medial lemniscal, is discriminative. So anterolateral is non-discriminative. Dorsal column is discriminative, but medial lemniscal. And examples are stereognosis, 2-point discrimination, precise localization, fine intensity gradations, high degree of spatial orientation relative to origin of stimulus. The afferent fibers are large and rapidly conducting. The origin is in the skin, joints, tendons, and specialized nociceptors. Projection is from dorsal roots of spinal nerves. They ascend to the medulla, synapse with the dorsal column nuclei, cross to contralateral side and ascend to the thalamus, then projects to sensory cortex. So this is the interlateral spinal thalamic tract. I'm going to move the dorsal up because I have a video up and ready to go. I want to record on this video. Pretty good. I love this one. Almost 9 minutes long here.
Is focusing on the dorsal column, also known as the medial lemniscal pathway. The pathways from sensory receptors to the cortex are different for the various sensations. We will mainly be focusing on the pathways which carries touch, vibratory sense, and proprioception sensations to the cerebral cortex. This pathway is the dorsal column, also known as the medial lemniscal pathway. Let's revise the spinal cord anatomy and some tracts. Here is a section of the spinal cord. The dorsal root here will carry sensory neurons from the periphery to the central nervous system, so to the spinal cord. The ventral roots carry motor neurons from the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system. The dorsal column tract is here, at the back of the spinal cord. It can be divided into two parts. Laterally is a fasciculus cuneatus, and medially is a fasciculus gracilis. The dorsal column tracts are responsible for carrying sensory information on touch, pressure, vibration, and proprioception to the somatosensory cortex in the brain. Let's take a cross-section of the brain and at the somatosensory cortex here. The somatosensory cortex is where the somatic sensory information is perceived. The thalamus here is an important relay station in the ascending pathway. The cerebrum continues to the brainstem, which is made up of three parts, the midbrain, pons, and the medulla. The spinal cord is here, and we're focusing on the cervical spinal cord as well as the lumbar spinal cord cross-sections. Dorsal aspect of the spinal cord is the dorsal column tract, part of the white matter, which again carries sensory information on touch, pressure, vibration, and proprioception. The cutaneous receptors, so the skin receptors for touch and pressure, including vibration, are the mechanoreceptors. Now, mechanoreceptors are found in a number of cells. Mechanoreceptors include Merkel cells, which carry touch and pressure information from the superficial skin. This cell will carry this sensory information to the dorsal column of the spinal cord, in this case, the cervical spinal cord. Ruffini endings are stimulated by sustained pressure. Meissner corpuscles are stimulated by sensory input of tap and flutters. Pacinian corpuscles pick up sensation, including deep pressure, as well as vibration. So when you use a tuning fork on the skin, the Pacinian corpuscles can detect these changes and send sensory information to the central nervous system. Each of these cells, which are stimulated by touch, pressure, or vibration, will carry this sensory information to the dorsal column tract. This cell is called the first order neuron. Now, again, the dorsal column, if you remember, is divided into two sections, the fasciculus cuneatus and the fasciculus gracilis. The fasciculus cuneatus is responsible for carrying sensory information from the upper body. And so, because this is the cervical spinal cord, this would constitute the upper body. So this first neuron will travel up the fasciculus cuneatus section of the dorsal column towards the medulla, where it will synapse with the second order neuron at the nucleus cuneatus. The second order neuron will cross over at the midline of the medulla and travel up the medial lemniscal tract of the brainstem towards the contralateral ventral posterior lateral nucleus, the thalamus. Here, the second order neuron will synapse with a third order neuron, which will then carry the sensory information in a highly specific way to the primary somatosensory cortex in the postcentral gyrus of the parietal lobe. The somatosensory cortex is divided into regions that correlate with specific areas in the body, such as the face, hands, legs. Specific areas of the somatosensory cortex, in this case, the hand, because this is where the sensory receptors detected something. This ascending system is called the dorsal column or the medial lemniscal system. It involves first order neurons, second order neuron, and third order neurons. The other thing I wanted to highlight is that sensation that is felt on the left side of the body is perceived by the right side of the brain as shown. Similarly, sensation that is perceived by the right side of the body is perceived by the left side of the brain. Remember, there are two sections of the dorsal column, the fasciculus cuneatus and the fasciculus gracilis. Fasciculus gracilis is a part involved in carrying sensory information from the lower limbs. In the lumbar spinal cord, depicted here, only the fasciculus gracilis exists, whereas in the cervical spinal cord, the fasciculus cuneatus and the fasciculus gracilis both exist. So imagine if this first order neuron is carrying sensory information from the foot and the lower leg. It will come to the dorsal column from the dorsal root of the spinal cord. It will travel up the fasciculus gracilis towards the medulla, where it will synapse with a second order neuron at the nucleus gracilis. The second order neuron will cross over at the midline of the medulla and travel up the medial lemniscal tract to the end at the contralateral ventral posterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus. Here, the second order neuron will synapse with a third order neuron, which will carry then the sensory information in a highly specific way to the primary somatosensory cortex, and specifically to the region of the somatosensory cortex which represents the foot or the leg. So those are examples of the somatosensory pathways of touch, pressure, and vibration. Let's now talk about proprioception. Proprioception is defined as the sense through which we perceive the position and movement of our body, including sense of equilibrium and balance. It basically is a sensation that allows us to keep our body balanced in space. When you think about proprioception, you think about proprioceptors, which are the receptors. And these proprioceptors are located in our muscles, tendons, and joints, and relay information about muscle length and tension. So let's recap the anatomy again quickly first. Here again is the somatosensory cortex, the midbrain, pons, and the medial lemniscal tract, the medulla, which have the nucleus gracilis and the nucleus cuneatus. The spinal cord is here. Let's just say it's the cross-section of the cervical spinal cord. Okay, let's talk about proprioception and the proprioreceptors. Let's look at the right elbow joint as an example of changes in muscle tension and stretch. Our muscles contain muscle spindles. The muscle spindles is a type of proprioreceptor that provides information about changes in muscle length. The Golgi tendon is another sensory receptor, a type of proprioreceptor, which basically lies on the tendons. The proprioceptors will detect changes in muscle tension and length, and then will relay this information through the dorsal column up to the brain. In this case, because it is the upper body, the first order neuron will travel up the fasciculus cuneatus and will go up towards the medulla, where it will synapse at the nucleus cuneatus with the second order neuron. The second order neuron will cross over at the midline of the medulla and travel up the medial lemniscal tract to the end at the contralateral side to the ventral posterior lateral nucleus. Here, the second order neuron will synapse with a third order neuron, which will carry sensory information in a highly specific way to the primary somatosensory cortex, to the region of the elbow joint, for example.
Wow, that is awesome. I really like that dude. I'm gonna go see if I can find one on the recording. I Okay, I found another video. It's not called the intralateral spinal ceramic tract like it is here, but he is talking about pain. So, by the way, he explains. Go ahead and listen to that.
Hello, in this video, we're going to talk about pain. We're going to focus on the ascending pathway of pain, and we're also going to talk about the descending pathway. As well, we're going to focus on an area called the substantia gelatinosa. Imagine you had a right hand injury. What happens, and how do we feel pain? The pain signal coming from the site of injury will travel up to the brain, and this is where the perception of pain essentially is felt. The signal going up to the brain is referred to as the ascending pathway. Injuries to our body is felt in certain areas of our brain called the somatosensory cortex. Let's recap the brain briefly. Here's the cerebrum, brainstem, and cerebellum. The somatosensory cortex sits posterior to the central sulcus. Let's get a cross-section of the brain like so and zoom into the somatosensory cortex. The somatosensory cortex is an area where sensation is perceived. This includes pain. The somatosensory cortex has areas which correlate to different parts of our body. So for example, let's look at the left side of the somatosensory cortex. The outer region here represents the leg, hand, and face. Again, this is your right side and this is your left side of the brain. The brain continues on and joins with the brainstem, which is made up of three main components: the midbrain, pons, and medulla. These are cross-sections of the brainstem. The brainstem then continues on and becomes the spinal cord. Here we are only looking at one section of the spinal cord. Let us say this section of the spinal cord is the cervical spine area. The spinal cord has nerves coming out from the anterior root and nerves coming in from the posterior root of the spinal cord. Here I am only drawing the nerves on the right side of the spinal cord. Different tracts exist within the spinal cord. One tract important in the pain pathway, or the ascending pathway, is the spinothalamic tract, made up of the lateral and anterior spinothalamic tracts. Let's go back to the right hand injury now. The right hand has an obvious injury on its palm. Within the area, there are immune cells residing. When these immune cells are damaged, or should I say when any cells are damaged, including our skin cells, they start releasing cytokines, chemicals. An important one in the ascending pathway are prostaglandins, represented here as PG. Prostaglandins are produced by nearly all cells, typically as a response to inflammation. Sensory nerve fibers exist all over our body. These sensory nerve fibers will respond to prostaglandins and will carry the signal or impulse to the back of the spinal cord or the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. This neuron is a first-order neuron. Within the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, the first-order neuron will synapse and relay this signal, this impulse, to the second neuron. This second neuron, called the second-order neuron, will cross over to the opposite side and will enter the spinal thalamic tract. From here, the second-order neuron will continue up, ascending through the remaining spinal cord, through the brainstem, and terminate in the thalamus of the brain. The thalamus is the relay station. In the thalamus, the second-order neuron will synapse with a third-order neuron. The third-order neuron will carry this impulse and relay it to the region of the brain which correlates with the injured right hand. Thus, the third-order neuron helps discern the area of injury, and also the cortex here is where the perception of the pain is perceived. Important to remember that this is the left side of the brain, whereas the stimuli, the signal, the initial signal was on the right hand. Thus, sensation always is on the opposite side of the brain to where the stimuli or stimulus occurred. Another important thing to remember is a chemical released by the first-order neuron to transmit or relay the signal impulse to the second-order neuron. This chemical is substance P. Thus, substance P and this whole area at the dorsal horn of the spinal cord is an important area for the ascending pathway. Now, whenever there is an ascending pathway, there is a descending pathway. While the ascending pathway is responsible for transmitting the pain signal up to the brain, the descending pathway is responsible for controlling and inhibiting the ascending pathway, essentially. Important areas of the descending pathway include the periaqueductal gray matter of the midbrain and the nucleus raphe magnus of the medulla. When not inhibited, the neurons arising from the periaqueductal gray matter will go down to the nucleus raphe magnus and synapse with a second neuron. This second neuron here is a serotonergic noradrenergic neuron. And this serotonergic noradrenergic neuron will travel down towards the dorsal horn of the spinal cord as well. The serotonergic noradrenergic neuron's role, in summary, is to inhibit or control the communication between the first-order neuron and the second-order neuron of the ascending pathway, and thus help control pain signals going up. There is another neuron here I am drawing in blue, which also plays an important role in this area, and we'll talk about it later. So this dorsal horn of the spinal cord is a pretty important area. We can call it like a gate, so gate control of pain. If we zoom into this area of the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, it can actually be referred to as the substantia gelatinosa. So let's just recap this whole area. Here we have the first-order neuron coming in and synapsing with the second-order neuron here. The first-order neuron will bring in an action potential, which will eventually stimulate vesicles to release its content into the synaptic cleft. The content here in this case is substance P. Substance P will stimulate the second-order neuron. The second-order neuron is stimulated and will propagate an impulse up to the thalamus via the spinal thalamic tract. Coming down from the medulla here in red is a neuron from the descending pathway, the serotonin noradrenaline neuron, which will release its content, serotonin and noradrenaline. These chemicals or this neuron will do two things. Firstly, it will bind onto receptors of the presynaptic neuron and inhibit the release of substance P. Second, it will stimulate a small neuron in an area called an interneuron. This interneuron in the substantia gelatinosa is actually an opioid neuron, which when stimulated will release an endogenous opioid called enkephalin. Enkephalin, like all opioids, will do two things in the substantia gelatinosa. One, it will inhibit the presynaptic neuron from releasing substance P. And two, it will inhibit the postsynaptic neuron from depolarizing and thus stop the continuation of the impulse up to the thalamus. All in all, opioids such as enkephalins will inhibit the ascending pathway of pain. So that was an overview of the ascending pathway and the descending pathway of pain.
Wow, I love him. So awesome. Seriously. He just explains it so good. That.
Among my patients, I often see that.
Okay, so that was the intralateral spinal thalamic tract. Non-discriminative. Non-discriminative. An example would be pain and temperature. The type of sensation is non-discriminative, and the type of non-discriminative sensation is pain and temperature. Broad spectrum of sensory modalities, crude localization, or intensity discrimination, or spatial orientation relative to the origin of stimulus. Small and slow conducting. Small, slow. The dorsal column is large and fast. The interlateral is small and slow. The origin is the skin, chemoreceptors, thermoreceptors, and nociceptors. Projection is from the dorsal roots of the spinal nerves. Synapse at dorsal horns. The fibers cross and move up the spinal cord, through the medulla, through the pons and membrane, to the ventroposterolateral nucleus of the thalamus. And basically that is what that last video was showing us, plus some. Okay. Okay, so aberognosis. Aberognosis is inability to recognize weight. Alesthesia is sensation experienced at the site remote to point of stimulation. Allodynia, pain produced by a non-noxious stimuli. Analgesia, analgesia. I have the hardest time saying some of these words. Complete loss of pain sensitivity. Asterognosis. Inability to recognize the form and shape of objects by touch. So the end of the word is ognosis. So asterognosis. This is agnosia. Atopognosia. Atopognosia. Inability to localize a sensation. Atopognosia. Inability to localize a sensation. Gosh, we can use that word a lot when we're writing in our notes. Inability to localize a sensation. Atopognosia. Causalgia. Painful burning sensations along the distribution of a nerve. That's another one we can use. Dysesthesia. Dysesthesia. Touch sensation experienced as pain. Algia. Hypalgia. Decreased sensitivity to pain. Hypalgia. Hyperalgia. Increased sensitivity to pain. Hyperesthesia. Increased sensitivity to sensory stimuli. Hypoesthesia. Decreased sensitivity to sensory stimuli. So esthesia, palinesthesia, loss or absence of sensitivity to vibration. Paresthesia, abnormal sensations such as numbness, prickling, tingling without apparent cause. Thalamic syndrome, vascular lesion of the thalamus resulting in sensory disturbances and partial or complete paralysis of one side of the body associated with severe boring type pain. Sensory stimuli may produce an exaggerated, prolonged, and painful response. Thalamic syndrome. Thermalgia, inability to perceive heat. Thermanesthesia, inability to perceive sensations of heat and cold. Hyperesthesia, the increased sensitivity to temperature. Hypoesthesia, decreased temperature sensitivity. And esthesia, like a Thigman, Thigman anesthesia, loss of light touch sensibility. Yeah, okay. Loss of light touch sensibility. Trying to come up ways to learn and remember these words. You know me, I'm always got to relate it to something. Anyway, so that's my return video to sensory spinal pathways and pain terminology. But yeah, I like the videos I found. It will help me when I come back and read this again. Yes, repetition. That's how we learn. And I will probably not do another video tonight because I've had a crazy last 2 days. But we will be playing catch up. Get caught up with it.